So beginning again with Lauren, she joined the GARN Youth Hub in 2020 and has stayed on since then. She's from the United States, where she's studying her PhD in environmental policy at SUNY. Her research focuses on the rights of nature, environmental justice, and community-based conservation. And in addition to her studies as well, she's worked on environmental educator and an English teacher for several years. Somabha is governance facilitator at Youth GARN this year, and she's a doctoral student and university junior research fellow at the Sciences. She pursues active research and activism on transgender law and their rights, and she's a member of the World Youth for Climate Justice, passionately working on rights of nature, also advisory boards of various organizations. Sarah Pritchett is passionate about community organizing and environmental policy, and has recently gotten involved in the rights of nature by finding GARN on social media. She lives in Bloomington, Indiana, and studies environmental and sustainability studies as an undergraduate student at Indiana University. In addition to GARN, she's also been active with the local Sunrise Movement Hub that is focused on organizing around various climate issues. Lastly, Alex Foulger-Fort. He's a legal intern at Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. He's also a law student at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Law, specializing in environmental law. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming.
So the workshop, we'll kind of split it into two parts because I know we got 2 hours here. The first part, we'll do a little bit of introductions amongst each other to figure out where we're from and if we've attended the previous sessions this week or not. And then I'll go over about 15 minutes or so of a policy process lesson. So how do we analyze policies and create policies? And then we'll go into breakout groups where we'll get to practice comparing different policies. Then we'll do a group share out and then 5-minute break. Then when we return from the break, will be the second part of the workshop where we'll share some rights of nature templates that you can use for creating your own rights of nature ordinances and other resources, and then some kind of self-reflection exercises and ways to get yourself grounded so you're ready for the next steps of creating your own rights of peatland policies. So just a kind of a quick getting a sense of the room, if y'all could write in the chat if you've attended the sessions earlier this week, maybe the number of sessions or like a yes or no, and get a sense of how familiar you are with peatlands and rights of nature to get this started. Awesome. A lot of the repeat folks have been to all of them. I'm excited to have you incorporate because I missed some of the first ones, which I know had a lot of cool decolonization ideas. So having you incorporate those into our policy analysis will be really interesting. All right, we got someone who this is their first one. And all right, Hannah's been before. Awesome. And a follow-up to that is, where are you joining from? So what country are you at? Are you part of an organization or a university? For myself, I'm joining here from the United States, and I'm at State University of New York, but right now I'm in Michigan, which is on traditional Anishinaabe territory. So we got someone from Sweden, Amsterdam, Netherlands, from the US, but in Chile. Oh, that's an exciting time to be in Chile. They'll have the rights of nature, potentially rights of nature in their constitution this weekend. All right, Germany and Canada, cool. I think if I had any other starting questions. Oh, do any of you have experience doing policy analysis or writing your own policies before? Okay, so it's the first time for a lot of you, but Bianca's done some. Cool. And did you attend the morning session today? Okay, Hannah's read a lot of them, great. So this morning, Somabha and I and Natalia Greene from GARN presented kind of a world tour of rights of nature laws. Cool. Looks like most of you were here this morning. Great. All right, so I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and go through a real quick policy 101. Oh, and this picture is one of my favorite bogs in northern Michigan. I did my undergraduate next to Wetmore Pond, Wetmore Bog. It's beautiful. Okay. So the policy process, and just as a side note, a self-reflective side note, is this diagram and where I've been trained is from a mostly Western European academic approach. I'm fortunate that State University of New York it's on traditional Onondaga territory, part of the Haudenosaunee. So I have gotten to learn from some Haudenosaunee teachers and Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmers at my university. So I've learned a bit of indigenous approaches, but still I'm at very baby levels of comprehending that worldview. So just kind of bear in mind as I go through these policy frameworks, these are probably more Western and European, where an indigenous approach might be emphasizing different values and processes. So feel free to internally critique these as I talk about them. It's not saying that this is the one way to do it, just keep an open mind. For example, a couple Haudenosaunee values would be 7th generation decision making. So when you create a policy, you're reflecting on your ancestors, previous generations, and also thinking, how will this policy affect the future 7 generations down the line? And that is typically not something that Western policymakers think about. We are lucky if we think to the next generation. We're very, very rarely creating policies 7 generations in the future, but that is an important Haudenosaunee decision-making value. So here, this policy circle, and I'll go through these in more detail in the next slide, but so at the center of the circle, you see stakeholder engagement and education. So this is something that should be iterative and continuing throughout the policy process at every stage. You're not just sitting in your own office creating these policies, but you're talking to others and you're getting that feedback and generating and changing your views based on feedback of everybody else, which this past week with your Peat-Fest, that's a great way of gathering that different stakeholder engagement. You had a really cool diversity of views, and I was really excited about that. And then also in the center, you see the evaluation process. So a good policy will have an adaptive management approach. So as you start something, you have ways to check, is this working? If it's not working, how can I change it? Or if you don't have that evaluation built in, you could get stuck on the wrong path and never realize it's not working. And then around the corners, you'll see, start with problem identification, policy analysis, strategy and development, policy enactment, and policy implementation. And then you kind of keep repeating it of making sure, is the policy, or is the problem solved, or do we need to keep revisiting it? So here is problem definition, which sounds like it should be simple. We're all here because we care about peatlands and we want to fix peatlands. But I'm sure if you asked each of us what we want changed, we'd all have a different way of defining what caused the problem. So what problem are we addressing? Thinking about what caused it, when did it start? And then think about where do we want to intervene? So depending on what problem, how we've defined the problem, we might want to address this at the local scale or an international scale or a mixture of those. Or we could collaborate with other groups so that we're working locally, but kind of feeding into this international movement. You want to think about what is the cultural context that you're working in? So as we define this problem, who is being impacted by this problem, and who are the stakeholders, or who's in relationship? And for our case, the peatlands, who's in relationship with peatlands at this location, both in a positive way or a negative way. And from a ecocentric rights of nature approach, that who would not just be limited to humans, but all of the different relations that we have. the plants and the animals and the elements and everything. And what are our core values and goals? So that's another one that takes talking to different stakeholders. We'd all define our goal a little bit differently, and that should ground how we create the policy. So these first brainstorming steps are important for your core group to work on, so that way you have a clear vision going forward. Once you kind of have those, your problem and your goal set, now you can start analyzing policies and figure out, how do I want to draft this? So first, what are my policy options? If you're working at a local scale, if you're just trying to get your university to talk about peatlands and do its field trips to the bog in a more respectful way, then your policy option is changing how field trips work at your university. And that might be an attainable goal within a year or within a semester. But if you're working at a larger scale, obviously your policy options are going to change. You have to work with different people and at different timescales. How have existing policies worked? Are there already peatland policies in this location? What are their successes? What are their failings? And are they addressing the problem that you've identified? They might be addressing peatlands, but in a different set of goals. And who have these policies worked for? And again, this who isn't just humans, but in a wider community. So maybe these policies work well for people of our present generation, but not for future generations, or not for dragonflies in 100 years, or whatever your who is. And what are the political processes here? Getting it passed in the United States is going to be different than the Netherlands, is different from Indonesia. You have to know your local context. All right. And then diving a bit deeper, policy analysis, which I don't expect, organizations don't need to be experts in this, but just kind of have an awareness of these different frameworks. There are a lot of different policy analysis frameworks you can use, and you can find them. You can find people who've come up with them and also people who've applied them just by going on Google Scholar. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can search policy analysis peatlands, policy analysis rights of nature, and come up with areas where people have already seen what policies are working and which ones aren't. So one kind of basic policy approach is this Eugene Bardach's 8-fold path policy analysis, which starts with you define the problem and establish your goals. You assemble evidence. This can be reports, scientific reports, measuring the size of wetlands, things like that, or peatlands. Literature review, who's been studying this over time. Surveys, both biological, but also social surveys. What are the community members who are working with peatlands think? And interviews, and gathering all that different evidence to help you create a well-informed policy. Construct the alternatives. So what are your policy options? And this is where we need that creative thinking. So the rights of nature approach is really trying for this paradigm shift of, all right, our existing policy options are getting us to a certain place, but it's not far enough. Select the criteria. So do you want to prioritize a policy that will be really quick and efficient, that's really equitable across different groups, that is currently legal within our existing paradigm? Or is it more of a, I forget the word for it, but you're kind of creating the future that you want right now? So like in the US, rights of nature is not really accepted at the federal level, and it's not really accepted at a lot of state levels, but local ordinances are still trying it, even though they know it will maybe fail if it gets brought up to the state level. But if your criteria is still to push it, you'll do it anyway. Project the outcomes. So you have the different policy options, you have your different goals and criteria, and you can compare them to each other. Like this policy might meet these certain goals, but not these. And you have to weigh them against one another and make your decision. And confront those trade-offs. There really isn't going to be a win-win solution that makes everybody equally happy. There's going to be some trade-offs and there's going to be some compromises, and you have to think about that and address them and be really clear and respectful about how those decisions were made. Make your decision and tell your story. Be able to explain how how you came to the policy choice that you did. Here is another policy framework. Again, there's many different policy analysis frameworks here, just two of them. This one kind of takes that initial define your problem, all that, but adds this intersectionality analysis in there. So an intersectionality-based analysis will also incorporate the power dynamics. So who is representing the problem? Who is analyzing the problem? Who has influence? And who is impacted? And all of this will change based on who has power and privilege in whatever society or community or worldview that you're working in. And that's an important layer to add into your analysis. What inequalities exist and how do interventions address them? So like within the rights of nature approach, we'd say that right now the power is really stacked to support humans, and that more than humans typically are outside of these policy thought processes and decision-making processes. So we would want, our power analysis would say, okay, we need more, the river should have a say as this decision. Who is representing the river? Who is speaking for the river? Or the peatland for this case. And then over here, you can kind of see those steps written out. And this is from Hankivsky et al. From 2014. Okay, so that, again, sorry, it's a lot of information all at once, but that was the policy analysis step of it. And then you think about crafting your policies. So let's say you've defined your problem, you've kind of selected the policy approach you want to do, what scale you want to do it at, and you start to write. You want to make sure you define your key terms so people are clear as they read it, they know what you're talking about. For rights of nature, it is like, what is those rights? What are the rights of a peatland? Want to choose your policy tools. So some of those tools could be education. Education's a tool that you can use. Fines and regulations, incentives, legal tools. So these are just different ways that you kind of have some sort of power to get your policy to work and to change people's behaviors. And then responsibilities and enforcement. So I'd say the more Western side of it, in the Western approach, we would think about who's enforcing it and who's in charge and who is kind of hierarchical top down, where I think a more indigenous approach or decolonial approach would think more about responsibilities in this reciprocal, less hierarchical framework. So kind of think about, you have this goal that you want and you want to enact it in some ways, who's going to make sure that it's being enacted and how do we hold each other responsible? And then evaluating it. You have to include in there, how is success going to be defined and who will be monitoring it? And will you have an adaptive management approach where maybe every 3 years you do another survey of the peatland, or every 2 years you do a survey of the community, just something to check in and adjust as needed. So here are a couple rights of nature models. This is a great book that came out last year by Craig Kaufman and Pamela Martin, who are both part of GARN, Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. So they did the Politics of the Rights of Nature book. This is also available free online. And they looked at all the different rights of nature models around the world, and they found different themes and where they differ from one another. So here are two models, the Nature's Rights model, which is used in Bolivia, Ecuador, and the US, says that all nature within a certain jurisdiction has rights. Ecosystems have unique rights that could be recognized. Anyone can speak for nature, but no one is obligated to. So in these cases, they don't assign someone as the guardian. Anyone could speak up on behalf of Lake Erie or whatever. And rights of nature are protected when the violations are reported and upheld. So it's a reactive thing. Another model that you see in Colombia, India, and New Zealand is the legal personhood model. Rights of a particular ecosystem are recognized. Human rights are extended to those ecosystems. Specific guardians are obliged to represent the ecosystem at all times. So they write into their policy, this is the guardianship group that's going to be always speaking on behalf and taking care of this river and bringing the river's interests to the decision-making policy or decision-making table. Guardians are embedded in integrated ecosystem management institutions. Rights of nature is reflected in decision-making. So this becomes a proactive thing. So like imagine my local town hall, if there's someone who was supposed to represent our local peatland at every town hall meeting, how might that change local zoning, all these little decisions along the way? Some more differences. So they did a policy analysis, Ecuador, US, and New Zealand. They look at how nature is defined in the different places. So it's all of Pachamama, all of Mother Earth. US, it's sort of municipalities, it's local level. New Zealand, it's specific, the Wanganui River and the forest. And then what are the rights are defined a little bit differently for different contexts. And then the strengths of them. So Ecuador, it's all the way in the Constitution. So that's the strongest maximum legal standing. In the US, it's pretty small, home rule charters, municipal ordinances. New Zealand, it's an act of parliament. Then you have hierarchy of rights are a little different. The US, some of the local ordinances say that rights of nature should be considered above corporate rights, which is something that corporations then bring to court and challenge because they do not like that at all. Who represents nature changes a bit. And is there a mandate for protecting nature? And Ecuador and the US, there isn't. In New Zealand, there is. Another thing to think about as we're writing policy is thinking about our language choices. So an anthropocentric approach would be human-centered, would have humans as the subject and all other species referred to as it or an object. Like at my school, it's an environmental school, but we still have entire disciplines talking about natural resource management. It's not a tree as an individual, this is our natural resource that we're going to manage for ourselves. Another aspect of this anthropocentrism policy approach is our time scale tends to be pretty short. We think about our own human lifetime, and we tend to think about who owns nature. There's this idea of property rights, and this ownership has to be assigned. Or an ecocentric, nature-centered, harmony of nature approach would respect all of nature. Nature is seen as her own subject with her own needs and values. It's a much longer time scale, future generations. You think about life on Earth, it's much broader than our little human life. And humans are in harmony with nature and reciprocal relationship.
As Bianca mentioned, I'm a law student. I specialize in environmental law. I'm not actually involved with GARN Youth Hub. I'm involved with the Legal Hub, but I was brought in for this. So as I'm doing all of this, I will have a bit more of a legal lens rather than a policy lens, but you know, they're not so far removed. So, okay, so the way we've done this is we have a couple policies. One of them is sort of quite a generic sort of natural resources policy, if you will. The other one's a more explicit rights of nature policy. So we'll just go over them both. I think we have 20 minutes, is that right? So 15 minutes left, so reasonably briefly. So I'm going to share my screen. Is this working? Can everyone see this?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm not going to read all of these. These are they're quite long, well, 14 pages. And this is technically speaking not a policy, it's a piece of legislation. So it's a law which sort of the result of policy, if you will. But I'll just read over some key sections that I think are relevant for our purposes. So, and just the preamble here. And again, this is the non-rights of nature one. It's more sort of standard natural resources legislation. So it says, whereas Manitoba contains millions of hectares of peatlands, and whereas the peatlands form part of large, complex, interconnected ecosystems, and whereas peatlands are the most efficient terrestrial ecosystem for storing carbon, especially over the long term, and whereas peatlands provide environmental benefits, such as filtering and storing water and preserving Manitoba's diversity, and whereas peatlands provide social benefits and community and rural opportunities, therefore Her Majesty by and with the advice and acts as follows. Okay, so then they follow with just some basic definitions, and you can sort of get a sense of where they're going with this piece of legislation just based on the terms they're defining. So, you know, commercial development, crown peatland, you know, harvesting licenses, provincially significant peatland, you can tell there's a bit more of almost an economic thrust to it, if you will. So I'm also going to read the purpose. So the purpose of the act is A, to protect and conserve Crown peatland, B, to regulate commercial development of peat on Crown peatland and ensure that it's carried out in a sustainable manner, and C, to ensure the recovery of the Crown peatland takes place. So this is followed by the principles, the kind of governing principles of the Act, which are A, peatlands play a significant role in storing carbon, preserving biodiversity, and maintaining the health of wetlands and ground and surface waters. B, that peatlands disturbed or destroyed release carbon into the atmosphere. C, that peatlands are of high ecological value. D, that healthy, sustainably managed peatlands provide responsible economic development opportunities. E, the financial cost of recovering wetlands often exceeds the cost associated with protecting existing wetlands. And F, a comprehensive approach to peatland management promotes healthy and sustainable peatlands within larger ecosystems. So as I say, this gets into quite detailed stuff thereafter, but I'll just very, very, very briefly go over it. So they're talking about protection and sort of what they're going to do to prevent, you know, the harms to the peatlands. They're talking about development and getting a permit to do it, and the kind of what's required to get a permit. Once you have a permit, what kind of rights you have to harvest the peatland or to do government. They talk about, I think a little further down here, I don't know if it's worth scrolling here, but they talk about compliance, for example. They talk about enforcement, they talk about who's going to enforce it, they talk about how inspections are going to be carried out. And it all gets into sort of minutiae around this. So royalties, whoever has a license has to pay royalties to the Crown. And it's all these kinds of things. So the first question I thought we could discuss is, based on what we learned from Lauren, what is the problem they're identifying in this piece of legislation? So I don't know if anyone wants to start with that. I can maybe provide some more context, but you know, they've written this whole act on ostensibly protecting peatlands. They're using some reasonably specific language to do so, but what do you think the problem that they're identifying is? Yeah, let's go with that.
Is it kind of just like who has access to extract from peatlands? Is that the problem maybe? Like,
yeah, I think that's
I'm not sure if I like heard anything about like peat is being extracted like too quickly, or there's too much and there's not enough or something like that. So maybe that's why I thought like it's more about like humans' rights to access and extraction.
You could maybe look at the preamble to understand what is the reason for which this act has been brought about. So maybe that could give you an idea.
Yeah, I find the preambles often the best because they're setting out guiding principles. So they're talking a lot about, how do we regulate the sort of harvesting of peatland? You know, clearly they are concerned with sort of over harvesting or harvesting the wrong way or overuse. And so they've enacted this huge, very lengthy, very detailed piece of legislation to kind of say, okay, this is how you're going to do it. You're going to have to obtain a permit from us. And in order to do that, you have to meet these criteria. Once you get the permit, you have to do these things. You have to pay us royalties. You have to comply with these things. There's going to be inspectors around it who are going to look at this and this and this to ensure that you're complying. We're going to enforce it in X, Y, and Z way. So yeah, I think the problem here is largely how do we regulate peatlands from an economic perspective, sort of as a resource, if you will. And just sort of based on the little bits that I read, and I say this cognizant of the fact that, you know, I only read little parts of it. But what kind of approach do you see them taking towards sort of solving this problem?
Landowners. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Permits and landowners, not like ownership, but like
so legally, I think the word you're going for is revocable license. So you're given a license, the government will give you a license, which you can then revoke in order to do what would otherwise be prohibited.
Maybe Amy or Irene, if you could also jump in this conversation, that'll be great. What do you feel?
I'm sorry, I'm actually very tired, so I would, I'll stay a little bit on the listening side if that's okay. I just feel like my eyes are hurting almost. And I also don't have much of a policy background, so it's going a little bit fast for me, and I'm happy to just absorb what is coming from
No, yeah, it's not about the policy background. Basically, we're just trying to evaluate whether this is not a policy, because this is a legislation, whether we are on the ecocentric end or on the anthropocentric end, or what are we doing with the peatlands? Is it protecting for its own right, or are we trying to protect it for nature? That is what we are trying. That is what Alex is trying to discuss here. So it's not really a policy analysis in its entirety, but it is kind of looking at it from that perspective also. So just feel free. It's okay to not have, neither do I or Alex, none of us have a policy background, but we are lawyers. I mean, he is soon to be a lawyer. So we are dealing with a law there. So,
I think the other thing too is once we look at the next policy, which is an explicitly rights of nature policy, like I think the contrast will become quite obvious as well.
Yeah.
We'll reserve some time at the end.
Emmy, I'm just trying to just get all of you on board. So that's why I am kind of pushing Emmy also. Maybe you could contribute. You could just share your views.
I'm in the same boat where I'm very unfamiliar with this, so I'm preferring to listen, but I'll try and contribute more.
I also thought it was weird that they said acknowledging that the costs of protection outweigh the wins of restoration. Or can you go back to that, because
I believe that
kind of goes against like everything that we kind of know about peat and how it forms. So the way they like went about evaluating this cost benefit like really feels just like blatantly economic, and also very like an economic valuation, which is like very, very limited, only taking a couple of variables into account. So I would also be curious as to see like who wrote this in the first place and who did the research for it, and like what is the research output.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a good point. That kind of like you can see the economic language in that principle for sure.
Yeah.
And I think even in the length, they're talking about, again, I know you haven't seen all of this, but they talk about compliance, they talk about enforcement, and even just as you're going through this, I mean, there's 14 pages of just this. Charge payable in addition to royalties, this restriction on transfer or assignment, like they're clearly viewing it as effectively a regulatory problem. Not a sort of, you call it a climate change problem maybe, or an ecosystemic problem, but they're saying, this is an economic problem which we need to regulate tightly, I think is my takeaway from it after reading.
Also, I'll just point out that if you look at principles, which is like 3.2, basically these are the principles. So imagine the governing principles of this particular law that you have is based on the principles of financial cost, principles of maintaining the peatlands for nature, for the human beings. So look at how the principles are anthropocentric, in the sense it is trying to give you a kind of a thought that you have to protect it because of your own needs, which is the anthropocentric one. So look at how you are, as Bianca very correctly said, that they are evaluating and they are they are doing a valuation of peatland. And the question is that, can we really do that as human beings? Do we have that much of audacity to value it? And then in what terms are we evaluating it? So I think that is where essentially the problems lie, maybe in conceiving of the principles itself.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the language, I will say for a piece of natural resources legislation, this is, I've seen more sort of anthropocentric ways of writing them. I mean, for example,
moderately woke.
Yeah, but even you think like in the title, they're saying stewardship, for example, they're sort of recognizing interconnected ecosystems, like they're sort of recognizing it to some degree. But, if you look at, this part of the preamble, for example, they're saying peatlands provide environmental benefits, or if you go to the purpose of the act, right? So the whole reason they're doing this, they talk about to regulate the commercial development. So I think in that kind of language, you can really see where they're coming from and what they're trying to do. And I think all this will be highlighted, and there's only about a few minutes left. So let's just move on to the second policy, because I think once you see the other one, the contrast will become a lot more clear. Okay, can everyone see this?
No,
Oh, really?
still on the Canadian.
Yeah, let me reshare it then. Okay, now, is that working?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this one is explicitly a rights of nature policy. And if you read, so again, I'll just read some of it. I'm not going to read all of it, but if we start with the top here. So a resolution of the Town Board of Trustees of Grand Lake in support of enhancing protection and stewardship of the Grand Lake area by recognizing the rights of nature for Grand Lake and its watershed, and calling upon the state of Colorado to also enhance state protection of lakes, waterways, and riparian ecosystems. There's a lot of this preamble, so I'm not going to read all of it, but just to touch on a few of the points they're making. So whereas the town of Grand Lake is nestled high in the Rocky Mountains near the Great Divide at the headwaters of the Colorado River, whereas the lake, which is the largest and deepest natural lake in the state of Colorado, is surrounded by wildlands of spectacular natural scenery. Whereas long before the town existed, the Ute people, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, supported the abundance of the land, whereas the land gave birth to the town. Whereas today the town's economic welfare depends largely upon visitors who are drawn by the natural setting. And I'm also just going to highlight some of these ones at the bottom too. So whereas the town board of trustees wishes to take all possible action to protect the lake and its watershed, whereas dozens of local governments in the United States, including a few in Colorado, have enhanced their efforts to protect the natural environment by formally recognizing that nature, including water bodies such as lakes and rivers, is not mere human property and is instead interdependent system in which humans are members with responsibility to care for the welfare of the entire community of life. And that's just the preamble. And so this is some of the actual what they're actually doing. So section 1, for example, the rights of nature of Grand Lake and its watershed. So Grand Lake, its watershed, its life forms, and other natural components exist and function as an integrated, interdependent system of natural communities, and are therefore recognized, understood, and respected in this resolution as a living entity possessing fundamental and inalienable rights. And so this talks about some of those rights, such as the right to support essential functions within its ecosystem, the right to feed and be fed by sustainable precipitation, to maintain native biodiversity, to the restoration and preservation of adequate ecosystem health. And they also talk about this board of trustees, which I think Lauren talked about a little bit, where you have a board of trustees sort of speaking for nature. So the board of trustees intends to protect the lake and the ecosystems of its watershed to the extent reasonably possible within its ability. Okay, I know we're running out of time, but I think the language in this one is just almost starkly separate from what we just read. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on this or comment on, or share their observations just from what we've gone over.
Yeah, I mean, the other one didn't say anything at all about, I guess, like the health of the land and the conditions of it. It only talked about like how it should be managed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and kind of it's health for its own sake rather than for the sake of commercial development.
Yeah, to add on to that, like the relationship that it's outlining, like that humans like should have in relation to Mother Earth is really different. And yeah, this one was definitely like less painful to listen to, it was much nicer.
I think we're really used to reading that kind of technical language when we see policy or legislation, and then you sort of see this, which is just, as I say, it's operating from a different starting point entirely.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Amy, you had any observations as well before we wrap up.
I think what I thought was interesting was it still definitely has a bit of an anthropocentric focus, which I think it makes sense because background noise. It needs to appeal to humans to some extent, this policy does, but it definitely was a lot easier to read for sure.
Yeah, and I think even when they talk about humans, for example, in the preamble, they talk a lot about the value that it brings to their community, but I think the way in which they talk about that is still different. They're kind of talking about it as, this brings value to us rather than sort of it's ours, if you will.
It's less economic focus too, I think.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
So I'll just come in there and I'll just tell you that look at how the structuring is very different. Of course, it's entirely different. But with regards to the point that you mentioned of still has an economic approach and it is a little anthropocentric, look how the balance is being maintained. So the fact here is that, this is what I was saying in the panel discussion, that you cannot ever say that we will be we will be entirely dealing with that rights of nature, peatlands, or rights of particular ecosystem. You will also have to balance it as against the people, as against development and all of it. But what is your objective or what is your goal is probably very, very important. That is why here it is the relationship which is being appreciated. It is the relationship and the fact that that Mother Nature has to be protected. Those get the importance. At the same time, of course, you need to have economic benefits and all of it. But economic benefit is not the ultimate goal. So I think you should look at those provisions and also in the preamble, those preambulatory clauses which deal with that. And so if you see, majority of it is ecocentric, and only a couple of them says that they are for some economic benefit. Like if you look at 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th preambulatory clause, look at the approach with which it says. It says that the town's economic welfare largely depends upon visitors, which means we're not really capitalizing on exploiting the area, but we are simply trying to say that we are having visitors. That is why this place is thriving. So that is the economic approach of tourism there, but not the fact that we are, let's say, exploiting the water there so that we can create a Coca-Cola factory. So that is the difference, so economic aspect is there for the tourism, but we're not really exploiting the land, the water basin, the area. So I'm just trying to tell you that how can you have a balance? Not that this is the perfect, there's nothing called the perfect, but this is one way by which we can have these two contrasts come on board at the same time. So,
Yeah.
That makes me think of maybe like, is it maybe a first step to shift a town or a region's economic incentive to be much more like, not necessarily like ecotourism, but something that doesn't depend on extraction solely, because that feels like it just ushers in the opportunity to just have like a different incentive and relationship and stuff to the natural world.
I think it depends a lot on sort of the area and the resource. I mean, people are a lot more inclined to visit, mountains and lakes than peatlands, for better or for worse. They're sort of more touristically attractive. So I think the way you'd approach this for peatland would look different. But if you think about, with the first policy, the first question I asked was, what was the problem being identified? I mean, the problems being identified in both these policies are effectively the same. Like there's some kind of natural resource or area or whatever label you want to call it that needs protection. In the first one, they were approaching it through very strict regulation, and this one they're approaching it through giving it its own set of rights. So it's two very different ways of dealing with the same problem.
I guess like a last point, do you mind scrolling down a bit to like the maintaining native flora?
Was that in the preamble or was that one of
here, yeah, I feel like this also kind of just reinforces how important like our scientific understanding of the natural world is. Because I think it's really important. Like I study ecology a lot, and restoration, and saying like maintaining native biodiversity in like the ecology world is understood as something that's like a really, it's like a controversial statement. Like what is actually native? Like like here they're probably referring to like most recently like introduced flora and stuff like that, but this is also kind of like a philosophical statement as well to a lot of like ecologists. Like how long do you look back when dictating like what is native and what is not native. Like we're non-native maybe to that area, or a certain tree might have only been introduced like 1,000 years ago, but is that native now or not? So it also kind of like, it makes it difficult to understand like what we're protecting and what does restoration mean and these types of things. So yeah.
I think the thing I think of from that is, I'm not an ecologist by any means, but these are just conversations that we haven't really had from a legislative or policy perspective because we haven't focused on it in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are we? No, I think, are we out of time?
I think so.
I saw this a few minutes ago.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was just gonna check in. Are you guys have any more closing thoughts? I could close the rooms now or give you a couple more minutes.
It's up to everyone here. I think, I don't know what the next stage is, but
okay, we'll bring it to the big group discussion. So if you had more things to say, we can say it in a big group.
Nice.
Good.
All right, welcome back, everybody. I know group one had some good discussions. I know it was fast. At first, we thought we'd only do one policy, and we're like, oh, 20 minutes is too much time. But then there's a lot. It's a lot of good discussion. So, so maybe because it's about time for break. So maybe I'll just have Sarah talk for 2 minutes about some of the summaries from your guys' group discussion, and then Alex could do kind of a 2-minute recap, and then we'll do a 5-minute break. So Sarah, you can go first.
Okay, so we looked at the Ireland National Peatland Strategy first to look at how they kind of talked about peatlands, and we kind of came to the conclusion that in the thing they were really kind of spreading themselves across too many different things, where they would be talking about climate change, but then they'd also be talking about industry. And it also used a lot of anthropocentric language. It was definitely about using having peatlands for human use, and the only reason that they needed to maintain them or make them sustainable so that they could use them for fuel, kind of just. And we were even talking about how at one point it kind of talks about using them for wind farms and stuff. And so it's definitely not just letting peatlands exist for them having rights. But yeah, those are kind of the major conclusions from that part. And then we also looked at the one for the lake in, I think, Colorado, and strategy was definitely a document made by the government to maybe put out to the public, whereas this one was much more legal and used much more legal language essentially. So that's kind of the main conclusions we made from that. I don't think I put anything else down.
I mean, we had a similar discussion. The first policy we looked at, well, it was an act actually in Manitoba regulating how peatland can be used and harvested, and our discussion kind of focused around how a lot of the language was about, sort of commercial development and harvesting and these very sort of strict regulatory regime on obtaining permits, the kind of considerations that it requires and what you can do once you have a permit. And just the stark contrast from that kind of wording to the second policy, we were also looking at the Colorado River one, which is a lot more focused around sort of the river itself and the watershed. And yeah, just that huge language. I don't want to just repeat what Sarah said, but it is similar themes in the conversation.
Awesome, thank you. And thanks for all the participants for jumping right into that. And it was kind of fast and quick to have to look at such dense language all of a sudden. And thanks for Alex and Sarah for leading the facilitation. So this next half, we'll share some resources for writing policies that are more ecocentric and rights of nature based. And then some reflexive exercises about how would you get started on a policy campaign, thinking about yourself or your organization, and then some prompts for inclusive organizing and coalition building, because that sometimes is one of the starting places for when you're developing a policy. It's hard to just do that as an individual. You want to work with others and gather support with you to make it more feasible. And then we'll do a survey within this group of what resources do you need, what challenges have you faced, and we can kind of help each other and see where we can find synergies. So some rights of nature templates and resources. There's an organization that's based in the United States, but they do work around the world, called the Earth Law Center. And they actually just put out a great textbook a year or so ago, all about Earth law, which includes rights of nature, but also ecocide and ending ecocide and indigenous legalities and rights of future generations. But within their website, they have this rights of nature policy template, which, let's see, how do I share that? And this is just a real nice, if you're going for a local ordinance, and I apologize, I know they kind of wrote this with the US in mind, so I'm not sure how well it translates to other countries. You guys would know how your local policies work better. But if you need some language to get yourself started, they have this real simple template. You can just plug in the name of your city and the name of whatever watershed. You change this to peatlands if you want to do about peatlands. And it establishes how the watershed has rights and the value of it. And then down here, starts to establish like the names of the ordinance, the purpose of it, and what are the rights. So instead of a river's rights, you'd adapt this to peatlands. So I think this is very specific to watersheds and rivers, but you could adjust it as needed. Yeah, Bianca.
So what is like the step of doing this? Like when you draft this up, do you just like hand it to somebody, or maybe you'll talk about this anyways?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So you'd think about, you do kind of those first steps in our the first half of the workshop of thinking about what's our problem, what's our goal, what's our scale and our audience. And if you've come to the conclusion that, yeah, we want this rights of nature ordinance here in my local town, that's kind of your scale and your scope, then you'd, I imagine, just kind of start showing up to town hall meetings, figure out who's on the council, how many votes are needed to get something like this passed. You could think about, has there been a certain current event that would get people to support it? You'd want to kind of survey, as again, part of that first half of our policy analysis, you want to do some stakeholder analysis, make sure that it's something the community would be for, and do that sort of education and outreach as it's being developed, and include other people in the process. But then, yeah, it'd be your local township, at least for the US context. I'm not sure how local laws are passed in your various countries, but yeah,
Okay.
this would be some stuff. So they establish some rights, and you might want to change those for peatland specific. And then in this section, they talk about the enforcement, whose duty and responsibility is it to make sure that these rights are upheld. And so they propose using that guardianship model that we talked about earlier that some countries use, where you establish specific people or person or group of people, it might be representative of different groups, who would regularly assess like what does this peatland need, and have someone speak for the peatlands at these town hall meetings. And here's some recommended categories of guardians. So yeah, so this is a good kind of starting place to get, if your group is working on an idea like this, it can kind of generate some starting places for you. Send the link of it. Yeah, just a second. So that link should work. If it doesn't, let me know. So that again is from the Earth Law Center. And that's one of the partners for GARN, Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. So other organizations that can help you with legal advice or drafting, and you could reach out to GARN, you could reach out to the Earth Law Center, movementrights.org. They specifically help a lot of Indigenous groups in North America. CELDEF, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and then Center for Environmental Rights, which I think you've had speakers from CELDEF and CEDAR here. I'm not sure about Earth Law Center. Some of these groups really overlap with one another. So I guess Somabha and I are kind of Earth Law Center affiliates in a way. All right. So then the next kind of steps, thinking about your organization and yourself as you get started on a policy campaign, do some self-reflection. So what is my relationship to this topic? What is my relationship to this location? Am I directly impacted, or am I an ally? And so like for me, if I had just moved to Ireland and was trying to tell people what to do with their peat, I don't think I'd be met very well. So you got to think about how am I going to be perceived as I advance this cause, and who should I connect with? When should I listen and when should I lead? Where do I have privilege and where do I face barriers? Just kind of understand your own situation, your own power, in reflection to the community and reflection to that ecosystem and your relationship to it. And everyone, even if you are new to a place, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be part of that movement. You just might have a different role at first, and over the time you can have different roles and step into it. And I think this is probably something that's been talked about in some previous sessions, and maybe your Sunday, I think you might have some more sessions like this, but thinking about intersectionality of movements. Another way to talk about it is constellations of co-resistance. I like that. So it's thinking about, is our work supporting other liberation movements as we advance towards shared goals? So there are a lot of shared systems of oppression. When you think about your problem definition, we were just in a meeting defining the problem as capitalism and colonialism is the root cause of the climate crisis. So if you define the problem that way, that's a shared system of oppression that other groups are also fighting against. So then you can kind of create these common visions of change, and we can learn from each other and support each other at different times in the movement. Think about your own positionality or your organization's positionality. A lot of us are engaged in several different movements at the same time. And something you'll probably come up against if you haven't already is you'll face tensions between movements, and people get this feeling that it's like a zero-sum game. If I'm advancing nature, then I must be against human rights, and you'll feel that tension, and you have to be aware that it will probably come up and think about how do you address that when it comes up. So you want to think about how would you challenge that perception, and we should be working in harmony, that humans are part of nature. This isn't a dichotomy. And so just kind of within your groups, as you go back later, think about what happens when you encounter these arguments. What are the emotions that are driving these responses? How do we react? And then go back to those shared problems and goals. You can probably find some ways to like, no, we're kind of on the same team. We have some of these similar goals. Our idealized future would come together. But recognize it won't always immediately be a win-win. There'll be some trade-offs, and you just have to be open about that and talk through it. And then thinking about the organizing aspect of it. So you have a policy in mind, and you want to figure out how do we get the rest of this community on board. And that could be a local community, it could be within your school, it could be different scales of groups. But getting people engaged. Is there something for people of policy analysis, but they might really like doing the artwork or the public speaking? Are your meetings accessible to different people? Does it balance work and joy? I've definitely stopped attending meetings when it always felt very dreary and too tiresome, and you have to have some joy in the movement. Different degrees of involvement. You might have 100 people on your listserv, but only 3 people show up to the meetings that are weekly, and that's okay. You have to understand that people have a lot of different things going on in their lives, and when is it important to have a big group versus small groups? Know your target audience, and can you collaborate with other groups? And then here are just different examples of ways to advance your rights of peatlands or whatever your causes are. You can do it in person, you can do writing, you can do just, yeah, all sorts of different things, public speaking, educational campaigns, protests, all of that. So again, summarizing that is thinking about aligning your movement so that your work supports other liberation movements, recognize that we can find common shared goals, work towards a shared future, and be inclusive in our language, our organizing, and our actions. Let's see what time it is. Okay. So we will go to breakout rooms our second time. And this is a lighter breakout group. It's just kind of your own personal experiences. And I'll put these, oops, I can copy these questions. I'll try and copy them and post them into the chat. But you'll talk about what's your connection to the topic, how'd you get involved, what scale do you want to work on, is your organization, are you doing this as an individual, and then what challenges, opportunities, resources do you need, and what next steps. So we'll talk about this in small groups for about 20 minutes, and we'll come back to the big group and share out, and maybe we can help each other as we face different challenges and opportunities. I really love something Bethany said. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Bethany, but your thought about thinking of like underlying values or something like that, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I just, what I think a lot about is tradition, and like how much of the value of tradition is driven by the act itself. So peat cutting, for example, and how much is driven of the value of that is driven by the underlying, I don't know, associated values it gave, whether that be like community in terms of peat cutting, because you were there with your families and your neighbors, so it was the community that it brought, or I don't know, sovereignty in the Irish case against the British, for example, to say like, okay, the peat really, the turf really symbolizes that we have our kind of self-determination. So I think a lot about if we can shift the narratives around tradition, maybe that changes doing the act and more kind of thinking, okay, how do we now do that in a changing world? Build that community or build that, I don't know, so the survival is then stopping doing the peat stuff, I guess. But this kind of idea around tradition, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool way to think of it and reframing things. I know Frankie's busy drawing right now, but another thing that kind of came up in our group is, I think maybe especially with younger kind of college age people, we're sort of ungrounded and we're moving from place to place. And so like, I know GARN is an international group and we mostly meet on Zoom, and same with RE-PEAT, they do a lot of meetings virtually. So it can be hard to feel like you're working on this place-based initiative or these nature-based initiatives, but we are staring at a screen most of the time or aren't grounded to a specific location right now. And I don't really have an answer to that issue, but I think it's and especially in COVID times, I think it's a unique experience, I think, for our generation in this time to be really passionate about the environment, but maybe not have strong connection to just one place, but to many places at the same time.
I think I'll just add on to that, because that creates more opportunities, which, since we were talking about opportunities, what Lauren mentioned creates more opportunities of connecting to more people and gathering and garnering support. But at the same time, it also comes up with its own hurdles. And that's what we were discussing in our group, that, because I remember in our group, Irene mentioned that it's difficult because RE-PEAT is it has a pan jurisdiction group that comes together, so that kind of becomes difficult. But that's where I think is also an opportunity to be able to lobby more and to be able to get more people on board to sign up for the same cause. So I think it's about, I mean, this is as old wisdom says, that opportunities can, challenges can always be converted into opportunities. I think that is actually, that's very true. So it is all about how well you are structuring your goal, how well you're structuring your plan of action. And I think based on that, all the hurdles can become opportunities, and interactions such as these collaborative works are the best ways by which you can expand your horizons, are the best ways by which you can have more people on board. And that's how I think so activism of this era is probably of this kind, not like in earlier times where you would have to physically go and do it. So I think we have to appreciate that difference as well.
All right, so just have a couple more minutes. I'll want to mention, just in case we have resources to help each other. Does anyone need resources? Or actually, I'll go group by group. Sarah, do you happen to remember what resources people asked that they needed for group one?
Well, money was one of them, which we can't really help with that. But I can't remember what Frankie said. They said something too, right? I can't.
Oh, reach, I think was one, maybe.
Oh, reach, yeah. I guess like being able to, like, they meant like reaching more people in general, like across, like, you know, maybe not just like because RE-PEAT's focused in Europe, right? So maybe like expanding beyond. And yeah, that's what I gathered from that.
And also just like media and kind of political reach.
Okay, yeah. Oh yeah, that's what you said. I was like trying to think. I was like, yeah.
You just came up with the new ones as well. Good.
No, I have kind of short-term memory. So
I guess one quick resource I could offer, so thinking about media reach, is tomorrow when Public Herald speaks, like they're an investigative journalist and do a lot of media stuff. So they might either help you figure out how to connect with local journalists or something like that. They might have some advice. And they're very nice. I've worked with Josh and Melissa, I think her name is. Great.
Did you put the details in the Jamboard?
I will, I'll do that.
Yeah, we
sorry,
also,
Irene, go.
No, that's okay. Actually, to add on that, Philip, who is he in the Zoom right now? He might be baking pancakes for his kids. Oh no, you're right there. You're also going to be speaking on Sunday about how to get your topic publicized. So that's going to be a really exciting session to look forward to. We also talked a bit about funding, which is a big challenge. Yeah, I think those came up on our site. If you would like to expand, Philip, on what people can expect on Sunday, go ahead.
No, actually, just sort of that was also a bit of a reflecting space for Sunday. But I mean, the one thought of top down, bottom up certainly comes into play. How do you launch a topic? And I do think that you can, of course, you are not top down, we are not the legislators, but I think you can take influence on people. And yeah, if I would go in the direction of a rights of nature law, and then I would also try that approach again to try to get someone on board and try to, we have a window of opportunity at the moment because it's a fashion topic. There is a lot of public awareness in the political space for wetlands in general and for the climate effects in particular. So I do think that we can put that on people's desks and say, hey, wouldn't that further your career, dear politician? And then it can also be politicians who don't have a green profile yet, just for that very reason. Yeah.
Just wanted to remind everybody that we'll have a screening. Tomorrow's like offline day, but kind of in the middle of the day towards the evening, we'll have a screening of the Invisible Hand documentary. And the director, the co-director Joshua Pribnak will be attending as well, and answering some questions and discussion. So I think it'll be really exciting. I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard really great things. So yeah, just like to invite you guys all. I'm sure a lot of the Youth GARN Hub has like already seen that movie, but for those who haven't, yeah.
No, you guys, it's cool that you're watching it at the end of all these talks because you've already heard all these key points. You'll see it and it's good. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And yeah, be in touch. Feel free to reach out to Youth Hub if you need anything.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.